Hello everyone, this is Daria Tarhan, the project coordinator for the People Power Planet Research Project. And it's 1 p.m. right now, but we're going to wait a couple more minutes for people to connect. So just bear with us for 2 more minutes. Thank you. So hello again, everyone. This is again Daria Tarhan, the project coordinator for the People Power Planet Research Partnership. I'm here today with Dr. Judith Lip, who's our project co-lead, and Dr. JJ McMurtry is sending his regrets. He's not going to be with us today. But we can get started with the webinar. And if you have any technical issues, please put it in the chat box or send it as a question. So our webinar today is on effective tools for enabling community energy development. And right before we begin, I'd like to talk a bit more about the People Power Planet partnership. So as you can see, it was formed to assess, document, and share the experiences and lessons of community energy developments across Canada. And our goal is to sort of increase the level of implementation of such projects nationwide. And we aim to do that through research, knowledge mobilization, and working with practitioners. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for generously supporting our research and knowledge mobilization activities. And I'd also like to let you know that the research about the renewable energy cooperative sector in Canada that we're going to share with you in this webinar is supported by Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, CMC. Also, we'd like to acknowledge the efforts of graduate students, without which we wouldn't be presenting this research. And here's a list of graduate students, both at the master's and PhD level, who contributed to our study. So thank you if you're also in attendance. Again, as I introduced, I'm Daria Tarhan, the project coordinator for the People Power Planet Research Partnership. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto. And with me today is Dr. Judith Lip, our project co-lead for the executive director of the Trek Renewable Energy Cooperative. And Dr. JJ McMurtry from York University is not with us today, unfortunately. So just before we start, just some housekeeping. As you probably already noticed, you will begin the webinar muted. And please keep it that way unless you're speaking in the discussion period, which won't be for some time. Please use the questions tab for technical issues only. And please use the chat tab for all discussion related, so community energy policy related questions and comments only. And you will notice a little hand on the left side of your control panel, and you will use that to ask to speak in the discussion period. And you will also notice that we have 2 polls. Some polling questions will be shown on your screen, and please answer them to help us build a picture of community energy and what your opinions are. So just again, before we start, just brief information about who's attending, who are your fellow attendees. We have about 49 webinar participants who registered, actually 2 more registered last minute, so we have about 51. And as you can see, Alberta and Ontario are, where the majority of our attendees are coming from, but we also have participation from BC, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and Saskatchewan, which is great. So just a brief outline, we're going to start by talking about very briefly, what community energy is, and then sort of map out community energy activity in Canada, what are the trends, what are the main challenges, and then we're going to share with you the effective policy tools for community energy development that we identify through our research. And we're going to conclude with our recommendations at the provincial and federal level, policymakers, and conclude with the discussion. So very briefly, community energy is direct community participation in and ownership of renewable energy projects, part or whole. So it is different than privately owned, whether by individuals or corporate renewable energy projects. And in order for a renewable energy project to be considered a community energy project, the local community members must have a direct financial stake in the project, other than land lease payments, tax revenue, or other payments in lieu of taxes. So the direct financial stake is key. And just very briefly, there are different ownership models, which are business models under which community energy projects are developed. And the legal structure, of course, impacts how equity is raised, how decisions are made, sources for grants or loans, and how profits are shared, and also how the organization is taxed according to legislation, which we will be talking about later. And the 5 main community energy ownership models across Canada are co-ops, Aboriginal ownership, community investment funds, nonprofit entities, and the MUSH sector, which is municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. Other models exist at the international level, such as community solar gardens in the US and different ownership models across Europe, but in Canada, these are 5 main ownership models. So very briefly, again, the community energy's benefits, at the economic, in the economic sphere, it's income and energy savings for community members who have a direct financial stake in the project, local economic opportunities and job creation, reduced transmission losses and energy security. This is related to distributed generation, so small scale, where electricity is generated close to where it is consumed. It has macro and microeconomic benefits. In the social sphere, social cohesion. So the fact that community members work together to develop a renewable energy project, it gels the community together and builds new bonds, and of course the result of that is capacity building and skills development for local self-reliance. So a successful community energy project may lead to many other, not only community energy, but community-oriented projects. And finally, the environmental impacts, of course, carbon emission reductions compared to fossil fuels and carbon heavy sources, increased public acceptance of renewable energy projects. A lot of research, especially from Europe, shows that community members are much more inclined to wind energy developments and also solar energy developments when it is owned by the community itself. And of course, there's also invoking positive energy behavior change. Electricity, through ownership in the electricity sector, becomes a part of daily life, and you become much more connected to it, which includes which invokes positive conservation behaviors. What has some other jurisdiction achieved with community energy? This is very impressive. In Germany, 50% of all renewable energy generation capacity is owned by individuals and communities, and over $5 billion in community money was invested in community energy projects. About 200,000 Germans own shares in renewable energy projects, and there's about 1,000 renewable energy co-ops. So this is very impressive. And they have about a history of 25 years with community energy policy and development. And a very similar situation in Denmark, have a very similar history. Both countries built on the social movements building up in the 80s against oil and nuclear, and the result was community energy supporting policy. And now, as a result, in Denmark, there are over 100 wind co-ops. 75% of country's windmills are owned by citizens, and over 150,000 families are members. And now I'm gonna pass over the floor to Dr. Judith Lip, and she's gonna start by giving a summary of community energy activity in Canada.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be on the call with all of you. So I work with the Toronto Renewable Energy Co-op, or TREC, and also with the Federation of Community Power Co-ops, which is an umbrella organization for renewable energy co-ops and community energy developers, to really create a united voice for the sector so that we can start to move these issues forward to address policy concerns and other barriers. So I'm going to share with you some of the research we did just looking at the activity across Canada. And again, I want to just thank Co-ops and Mutuals Canada, who helped fund this particular research that is allowing us to understand the extent of renewable energy co-op across Canada. The other thing of note, of course, is, you know, we were asked specifically to look at the co-op model as it applies to renewable energy because, of course, the funders' interests, but we need to remember community energy, as Daria has pointed out, can also include other types of models. And a lot of what we'll be sharing as far as recommendations and challenges will apply outside the co-op sector as well. So just a brief overview of community energy activity in Canada. So Ontario is definitely leading with 175 megawatts of co-op participation and 800 megawatts of Aboriginal participation in renewable energy projects. Of the 175 megawatts, we estimate there are about 75 megawatts that are majority owned by renewable energy co-ops. So because of the policy in Ontario, we do have a dominance of co-ops leading community energy as outside of the Aboriginal sector, where more band councils and corporate structures have been created to own those projects and participate in those projects. In Nova Scotia, the model that's most common is the Community Economic Development Investment Fund, and there are no co-ops, but 200 megawatts of community renewables have been built, have been commissioned in that province and under construction. British Columbia is definitely seen some Aboriginal power, but so far as we know, just one renewable energy co-op that's generating power from renewable energy sources. Again, if you look at the study that we did for Co-ops and Mutuals Canada, the executive summary of which is on the People Power Planet website, and we'll share those resource links at the end. The final report is due out in a couple of weeks. The executive summary is completed, but you'll see some of that. We sort of go further into the definition of renewable energy co-ops, you know, generation versus distribution versus energy efficiency, etc. So just to be clear on that, there are more co-ops in BC doing some form of, you know, energy work, but as far as generating power, there's only the one Peace Energy Co-op. We know that there's interest growing. There are certainly co-ops incorporated that have started to develop projects, none of which are generating power at this time in the rest of Canada. There is probably, as far as activity, Quebec has a number of co-ops that are pursuing renewable energy projects. And again, those details are available in the final report. Our history here in Canada is not nearly as long as in Europe, where generally renewable energy has been embraced for a much longer period of time. Community energy development began in the late 90s here in Toronto with the formation of TREC and the Windshare Co-op, and it's sort of grown from there. So the policy and renewable energy targets are the main determinants of community energy and Aboriginal power activity everywhere, and we're going to get more into the specifics of that as we move through the webinar. Just a quick slide to show the level of activity of, again, now we're getting into specifically renewable energy co-op activity. As you can see, as I've mentioned, Ontario is by far the leading jurisdiction as far as renewable energy co-ops is concerned. Just a couple of details then, specifically coming out of an annual survey conducted by the Federation of Community Power Co-ops. These are results that were collected just under a year ago from 23 renewable energy co-ops across Ontario, out of 31 that were contacted that we believe are involved in some way in renewable energy generation. So of the respondents, the sector has assets of 94 million under management, with 18 of 23 co-ops reporting at least some asset ownership. And by asset, I mean renewable energy generating assets. There are 212 FIT projects and 1,000 microfit projects, mostly solar, 75 megawatts in total that are majority owned by the co-ops. As I've already mentioned, there's 175 megawatts that have some community participation. That can mean, community participation can mean as little as 15% participation, and also different structures as far as control and revenue sharing. And so it's a little murky as far as our understanding exactly of who's benefiting, who's meeting that definition that Daria mentioned of direct financial benefit. So far, only one biogas co-op and 2 wind co-ops are in the mix. Sorry, that's too far. And then on the community finance side, at the time of the survey, and that was sort of May, June of 2015, there was almost $30 million raised in capital securities, 15.5 million in shares, and 11.4 million in bonds. That number has definitely changed. We are very much, this sector is very much expanding and growing, with co-ops still in the process of building their projects and raising finance. So those numbers are changing all the time. You can see here just the difference between the last time we did the survey, which was in 2013, 2014, and the status of projects. So obviously this sort of illustrates the point that I've just made, which is their projects are, co-ops are very much in the process of development and not yet at maturity. So tallying up final numbers at this point is not possible. But it gives us a good sense of the growth of the sector and the status of things at a point in time. The distribution of feed-in tariff contracts, and I will get into a bit more, and that's really the latter half of our presentation, is really about the feed-in tariff program and the design of that vis-a-vis promoting community energy. But here in Ontario, the feed-in tariff contracts distribution is shown in this pie chart. I think it's illustrative to see how those contracts have been distributed. And again, this graph is developed from numbers produced by the Independent Electricity System Operator, which is the IESO. The IESO doesn't really distinguish between majority-owned and minority-owned participation, and so this is an aggregate of those 175 megawatts and 800 megawatts I referenced before for Aboriginal and co-op, respectively. So as you can see, the sector is definitely dominated by the commercial side, with 78% of contracts going to the industry. So of those 78, there would be no community or Aboriginal participation. 18% of the contracts do have some Aboriginal participation, and 4% have some community or co-op participation. I just wanted to say a few words about the Aboriginal power side, just to acknowledge the work that has been going on. There are over 500 FIT projects, 500 renewable energy projects with Aboriginal participation. They're really found around the province. As you can see, we have a map on the People Power Planet website that is interactive, so you can actually click on any of these icons that are static here on this presentation, but you can click on any of them and find out more details about the project. So that was just obviously one of the contributions we wanted to make as the PPP project, was to understand where are these projects being developed around the province. And we have a similar map actually for co-ops, and we also have one for Nova Scotia, which I'll also have a screenshot of a screenshot of in a moment. Just to highlight some of the developers on the First Nation side. We've got Deer Lake First Nation, that's got a solar system on their elementary school. Bow Lake Wind Farm, developed by Botswana First Nation in partnership with the developer, and Dokus First Nation Okindawat Hydro Project, which has also been, these are just really a handful. As I mentioned, there's 500 projects, so there's quite a lot of projects there. I can point you to a resource that Trek was involved with the Chiefs of Ontario. I should have a link. We can probably make a link available on the PPP website. It's called the First Nations Electricity Report, and it summarizes a lot of the activity and some of the challenges and barriers and considerations specific to Aboriginal renewable energy projects. And it's an ongoing work that we're doing with the Chiefs of Ontario, and so we'll be able to update more on that in the future. Just to acknowledge what's happening in Nova Scotia. So there is, as I mentioned, the CDIF model is the more common model that is being used in Nova Scotia for ownership of community energy projects. There are 200 megawatts of community energy overall in Nova Scotia, and there's 10 CDIFs that are developing 115 megawatts of renewable energy generation. So again, this map is available on the PPP website, and again, it's interactive, so you can see exactly, you can sort of click on some of the project details. And we'd like to acknowledge Michael Bayek's work on this. He was one of the students at York University that is working with us, and he developed all the maps on the website. So New Brunswick, I just want to acknowledge there is some preliminary activity in New Brunswick on community energy. It's still a policy that's in discussion and under review. They've called it the LORESS program, locally owned renewable energy projects that are small scale. So draft rules are out, they're currently in review. There is, as I understand it, a COMFIT component, and those of you in New Brunswick can probably speak more to the status of those regulations and when they'll be coming forward, and we'd love to hear from you if you are indeed on the call, and just share with us your insights about what's happening in New Brunswick. The target for the LORESS program is 80 megawatts of community feed-in tariff capacity, of which half will be dedicated to Aboriginal proponents. So this is, just wanted to take a little break just to get, just to give people a minute to think about this question before we move on into the policy section. Are there any, from what you've heard to date, we've summarized sort of programs that have been announced or programs that have been completed related to community energy. There's certainly some activity, we want to acknowledge that in Alberta, some interest in a renewables target, but no, there's not yet been any kind of rules, as far as I'm aware, that have come forth specific to community energy. That may or may not be the case in other provinces as well. So I'm really interested to hear from folks on the call about any updates, corrections on what you've heard, or anything that may be missing. And so if you could, you can either do that in the comment box, that way everybody can see your contribution, or you can also email Daria directly at daria@trek.on.ca. So just maybe I'll give everybody sort of 30 seconds. I'll also give myself a break from talking, and then we'll reconvene in 30 seconds and we'll read out some of the comments as pertinent. Okay, we'll be right back with you in half a minute. Okay, great. So I'm back. Thanks for sharing. There's definitely somebody who mentioned there are a few other co-ops that are starting up in Alberta. So we will make note of that. And if the individual that provided that comment wants to send the details of those, and just so we can cross-references with our list of co-ops across Canada, that would be really helpful, and so that we're always staying current and up to date. There was also a question related to Aboriginal projects in British Columbia, and there was a link to a document, which of course we haven't had a chance to look at. I do want to just acknowledge that there is in our research, if there were aspirational comments and targets that province had articulated, we did not include that in the paper because aspirations are different from actual policy announcements and projects moving forward. So just to be clear, when provinces have kind of indicated their interest or intentions, we don't always capture that because there have been a lot of those aspirations over the many years. And many of them haven't moved forward. So we're really interested in kind of where there's some concrete examples and some concrete progress being made. But we're still appreciate the comment because it's something to keep our eye on. And certainly if there is more concrete information that people on this call can share, then we definitely welcome it. So this next section, I want to just touch on the key challenges facing community energy in Canada. I want to just acknowledge that this is based on research, but also, of course, of our practitioner experience or our practitioner experience here in Ontario. So TREC is working in partnership with a number of renewable energy co-ops and has been really in that, working in that area, incubating and supporting renewable energy co-ops since 1998. And so, a lot of the comments that I'm going to be making are based on direct experience, working with TREC, but also working with the Federation of Community Power Co-ops, as well as also these, these challenges are informed more generally by international experience, as are the policy recommendations that will follow. So just to give a little bit of context, this is definitely, the comments I'm going to make are definitely a blend of research and practitioner experience. So the key challenges that we've identified are accessing the market and the grid. So community energy projects have difficulty accessing the grid in competition with corporate projects or monopoly/public utilities. So it is the electricity sector is heavily regulated. It has been the purview of large corporations and utilities, and it is only a relatively recent phenomenon that this idea of prosumers, people who produce and consume power, that individuals, farmers, co-ops, community groups, Aboriginal communities, etc., that they are in a position to participate in that market. So that's a recent phenomenon enabled through things like a feed-in tariff program. And so, but where those programs don't exist, and now I'm getting ahead of myself talking about the policy, but that access to the grid and the market and having a level playing field to participate in that market is one of the key barriers to community energy in Canada as it is elsewhere. Project development capacity is another area we sort of that we've identified, and we see it on a daily basis as co-ops around Ontario are working super hard to get their projects built. Many of them have worked with very low operating budgets, so there's a strong reliance on volunteers, often in the through the directors who help start these co-ops. If I think about SolarShare as an example, which is a solar co-op here in Ontario that has over 6 megawatts of generating assets. I go to the SolarShare board meetings. We've got, there's individuals there that are doing the accounting and the financial modeling and providing legal input, providing marketing, etc. Not to say that there aren't also paid individuals, but it took time for the co-op to be large enough to be able to pay individuals. And I think that's really this challenge around capacity, is that these are complex projects, they are long timelines, and often, there can be burnout from volunteers because these projects can take such a long time. Finally, access to financing is sort of our third big area, challenge area that we've identified. Access to long-term debt at competitive rates can be a challenge for a number of reasons. One is sometimes we're just simply too small to be looked at by the financial sector, who's used to lending, tens of millions of dollars. The cost to lend to small projects, is similar to the cost of lending to large. Therefore, they make a preference for large projects because it's just a better, it's less transaction cost for them. There's also a lack of institutional history for those community energy projects that are starting out. There's really nothing to validate the robustness of those organizations, those co-op, whether it be co-ops or other models. And then I guess, although this is changing, but lending to renewable energy is also relatively new in certain parts of the country where there has not yet been an established sector. So we're definitely seeing access to finance as a challenge. At the same time, raising money from your community is a challenge because in the early stages, because your project hasn't reached certain milestones that assure that it's going to go ahead. And so we sort of have this conundrum where the long-term debt isn't there, but the community debt also is hard to raise until you've reached certain points in your development process. So these are the three areas that we're going to elaborate on as far as some recommendations. I want to acknowledge there are other challenges, and I'm interested to hear again from this audience, what are the key challenges that you've witnessed, in your jurisdiction? And if you could, again, just use the comment box to share your thoughts on that or send us an email. We would greatly appreciate your input. So again, I'll give sort of 30 seconds just for people to collect their thoughts on that particular question, and then I'll move on to addressing each of the challenges. Okay, back again. Thanks everybody for your comments. We definitely have some good comments about just capturing other projects. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge, through this very high-level summary, we probably aren't capturing all the details in each of the provinces. There certainly are activities, and it was noted in Alberta. For sure, there are projects in the workings, and again, it's sort of at what point do we capture them as sort of moving ahead versus, ideas. So, just recognizing that's a bit of a fluid piece, and we do apologize if there are projects that, should have been captured and expanded on. We'll definitely be keeping, that's the role of the PPP work, is to try and capture that and keep a handle on things. There's also a comment about the federal policy, and so we are going to have a section talking about that. So I'm going to move on and come back to that. So now we're going to talk about tools and policies to address the challenges. So thinking about the first challenge, which is accessing the market and the electricity grid. So this section is really intended to help inform policy design. Obviously, this is high level. We aren't going to get into the nuances of a particular policy, but in our experience and looking at experiences in different parts of the world, the recommendations that I'm going to be presenting in the next the next 15 minutes or so really are sort of the keys to moving community energy forward. And really fundamental to that is the feed-in tariff program, FITS for short. I know there's an anathema in some parts of the world to call feed-in tariffs feed-in tariffs. I guess there's some misconception around their efficacy and the cost associated with FITS. But I think that's misguided. I think that's if we think about and I picked this up when I was in Alberta. There was this sort of resistance to FITS and that they increase electricity rates. I think what we need to remember, a feed-in tariff, at its foundation is a rate. It's a predetermined rate that power producers are guaranteed for a defined period of time. So 15 to 25 years is often the range used. And they're paid that price for every kilowatt hour of electricity that their projects feed into the grid. And I think what's really interesting about FITS is that they are, the fact that you're only getting compensated for the power that you produce is really why I would not define them as a subsidy. And people like to do that, sort of paint them with one brush. A feed-in tariff had some kind of feed-in tariff program or this mechanism where a price is determined on the basis of the return that developers need to earn is really the foundation of electricity policy across every jurisdiction where power generation has been built. It's really only in recent years that we've gone to these competitive procurement processes. But in the past, if a jurisdiction wanted power, they would have to find somebody that would build these projects, and they would have to define what the rate of return is. So that's really how modern utilities have been formed. And so it's really just that same principle. And so I just want to point that out. Their FITs are not subsidies, but why they're helpful to communities is because they define the rate that you're going to get paid. And it also helps level the playing field because as a community group, you might not be able to bid into a competitive process. You can't possibly develop your project at lower rates than a large multinational corporation. And so FITs are essentially key to leveling that playing field. Just in terms of the terminology, I think, if some people feel like, the reputation, there's a reputation risk with FITs because of the misunderstanding of what role they've played in Ontario vis-a-vis the power rates, which, again, we won't get into it in this webinar, but certainly there is misinformation around the impact of renewable energy projects and the price of power in Ontario. Renewables contribute only a small portion, but just a suggestion for those out there that are, and I know there are some in Alberta thinking about, what does that policy ask? I've suggested community energy contracts might be another way of selling the FIT. As long as the mechanism is there, it doesn't really matter what we call them. And again, the mechanism is this fixed power rate calculated on the basis of a reasonable return on investment. And there's, so let me get a little bit into the FIT features. So some of the specific features that Ontario has introduced alongside the sort of the basic policy. So just to acknowledge, it was introduced in 2009 through the Green Energy and Economy Act. We've had 4 rounds now of FIT contract applications. Where 4 rounds where people could put in applications to get a FIT contract. The first one was in 2010. It was an open-ended FIT round, which essentially didn't have an end date. There were a number of mechanisms to encourage community and Aboriginal participation. For instance, there were price adders. So if you were a community group or an Aboriginal group, you could get an additional cent or an additional 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour if you were developing a wind or a biogas project, or if you were a commercial developer developing those projects in partnership. There was also a broader definition of community groups in Ontario under the first round. So it included charities, it included not-for-profits, it included groups of citizens coming together as limited partners. As long as they weren't involved in the energy sector, they qualified as community groups. Those rules were amended under FIT 2 going forward, and that was in part because community energy projects had a difficult time accessing capacity because they were essentially still competing with the commercial developers within the FIT program, and so it was recognized that there needed to be a set aside for co-ops, Aboriginal, and then under FIT 3 and 4 for municipal participation, because these were these were players that were not typically involved in the energy sector, didn't have the deep pockets, couldn't not always necessarily get the consultants to, or have staff on hand that could get these projects in. So it was taking them longer to get their applications in. And so what happened in FIT 1 is the window was eventually closed under FIT 1, and very few co-ops had gotten their application in, and so they were essentially shut out of the process. So under FIT 2, there was a set aside created, and it was for 25 megawatts each of co-op and Aboriginal participation. And then FIT 3 and 4, there was municipal was added. The other piece that was added to the FIT 2 window was there were points awarded for co-op, Aboriginal, and municipal participation. So what I should add is for the set aside, you needed to be a majority-owned community energy project to get points. So if you were a developer and you were trying to sort of be in a better position to be awarded a contract, you had to collect points, and there were different criteria for those points. And community energy participation was one means by which points could be acquired. And so that's where a lot of the minority participation projects contracts are from. The price adders for community and Aboriginal participation continued under FIT, the subsequent FIT rounds. And I've mentioned, so the co-ops for sure, and I believe on the Aboriginal side as well, they benefited from this set aside. And we did see 25 megawatts of co-op power emerge from that first set aside, and it's been growing from there to 75, which is the current. The future of FITs in Ontario, also I think it's important to recognize that the longevity of policy is important. What's interesting is I won't get into the specifics of sort of power policy in Ontario, but we're definitely threatened here in Ontario through the province's commitment to refurbishing nuclear power plants. So that could put the future of FIT, into question. And certainly the province has also reverted back to an RFP. So that's a request for proposal process, which is highly competitive, and it's just awarded the first round of those projects, of which there are no community participation. There is Aboriginal participation, but not community participation. So, all that to say, there is certainly some uncertainty around the opportunity for renewable energy co-ops and other community energy projects in Ontario going forward. On the COMFIT side, just to acknowledge, so Nova Scotia's program did require 51% community ownership. The FIT rates were issued for 20-year term. They included wind and biomass and tidal energy, but no solar in their program. And that's the bullet from before around the number of CDIFs. So again, what's interesting is the other feature of the FIT program is this sort of tiered approach to the pricing. So the way that a FIT rate is calculated is really looking at how do we, what does the price have to be to allow the developer an 8 to 10% return on investment over the life of the project, because that's the only way you're going to get interest from the commercial sector to participate in this market. And so that's how those prices are set. And what they do in Ontario is every year they do a FIT price review, and they look at whether those rates are still are meeting that sort of 10% threshold. And what we've seen in Ontario, every round of the FIT program, consistently that price has come down to the point now where we've seen a sort of 30-40% drop in the solar FIT rates, because that's what the market is indicating: global pricing, the price of components, etc. So that's another key feature of the FIT program is this annual price review, and it's really the piece that should provide comfort to policymakers that this isn't just a sort of a runaway, cost of these contracts, is that it can be very controlled and measured, and just needs to be regularly reviewed, and well communicated, so those participating understand that those price reviews are happening. Just a couple of complementary policy tools to the FIT. One is, as I've mentioned, so the set-asides, or to have a dedicated community FIT program, as Nova Scotia has introduced, is hugely important for that competition that can happen. The community adders can be important and can help the economics of a project. So again, depending on the pricing, the price point that gets issued for the commercial sector, a community power project often is more expensive to develop because you're engaging a lot more people, but that's also one of its huge benefits. So if you consider the work that these co-ops do to bring, educate their communities about their projects, but also about renewable energy, that's where that's where the real value of community energy lies, and it has those knock-on benefits that Daria referenced earlier. So there can be a real advantage to, it can be a lot cheaper to provide a community group with an adder so that they can afford to do more marketing and outreach than to fund that in other ways, because that's your strongest ally really on the ground, are those groups developing projects. Then there's also the community ownership mandates for commercial projects. So the point system in Ontario, I'm not convinced it's the best model. In Denmark is interesting. There's commercial renewable energy projects that are mandated by law to offer at least 20% ownership to the local population. To me, that's a much better mechanism, because you're requiring, again, a stake in the project, as opposed to in Ontario where you get points, and the mechanism by which co-ops or Aboriginal groups are participating can be very loose, and not necessarily reflect equity participation. On the capacity building side, there's a number of recommendations we would make. So as I mentioned before, the challenges get raising money when your project is in sort of pre-feasibility and feasibility stage, and those early startup costs are hard to cover. So project development grants have been key. Certainly Ontario has a program to support that. These existed in a number of European jurisdictions as well. There was also easier access to finance in Germany in particular. It was very straightforward to go to the local banks and acquire a loan for a renewable energy project. So these are some of the mechanisms that can be implemented. One of the things we've suggested, because a grant can feel, if a grant on a project that's successful that ends up earning, millions of dollars in revenue, it might be unpalatable. But a revolving fund where a project that's successful is required to repay their startup costs, I think, can be a very useful way of mitigating these sort of criticisms, I guess, of using grants and using public funds to support community projects. It sort of gets down to a little bit to a philosophical approach to these things as well. But certainly some kind of access to some funding to allow groups to get started is pretty fundamental for large-scale success. Supportive securities legislation, so the ability for community groups to sell financial products is key. The co-op sector, has that built in, which is why co-ops have been used here in Ontario. CDIFs are also structured that way. Again, if you want to look that up, it's the Community Economic Development Investment Fund model. And then there's, of course, crowdfunding, which is a relatively new phenomenon, sort of emerging in the last 5 years. And we know a couple of groups that have applied that. So other important pieces just around, simplifying the process and helping with, startup, so one of them would be reduced security payments to apply for FIT contracts. That's something that Ontario did. And then the streamlined application processes. Again, if you're doing wind, ground-mounted solar or wind, or biomass projects or hydro, there are a lot of regulations, rightly so, on environmental assessments and land use planning and these various considerations. So streamlining that and making it as simple as process as possible. In Ontario, again, they created the Renewable Energy Facilitation Office to help proponents, move through the various stages that their projects needed to move. And again, it made sense to kind of create, a central focus for that. And again, there's definitely, I'm sure, good experiences from other jurisdictions. Obviously, working here in Ontario, it's where I have the most experience, which is why I'm referencing those. In the full CMC report, which will be out in a few weeks once the funder has approved it, there will be more details from other jurisdictions as well. Financing, final point here on barriers. So community economic development investment funds, the CDIFs, are certainly an important mechanism to enable the raising of community finance. There's favorable taxation rules, there's RSP eligibility, there's various mechanisms that encourage individuals to invest in these CDIFs, and these can be applied to renewable energy projects as they have been done in Nova Scotia, but they can also be applied to other economic development activities, which is where they actually originated in Nova Scotia, was applying them to other types of local projects. And it's really it's a mechanism of keeping the money local, and that was sort of one of the impetuses for the CDIF in Nova Scotia, as far as I understand that history. There are the loan guarantees. So, as I mentioned before, the commercial sector may not have comfort in financing community energy for various reasons. One of them being reputation and lack thereof. And so loan guarantees can be a way to mitigate that, and were certainly found to be key to the initial German success of getting community energy projects off the ground. And scaling the project right is also an important piece related to financing, maybe related a little bit outside of financing as well, which is really to say that if you are developing a community energy project at too small a scale, you might not be big enough to carry the cost of that development and managing that project over the 20-25 year history. So that's an important feature just to remember as far as any kind of community energy policy, is that those projects can be built at a size that enable economies of scale. So those are our comments on financing and generally our recommendations. Again, these are summarized in the executive summary of the Canadian Co-op scan that is on the PPP website. Again, we want to just take a minute here. If there are any other key tools and policies that have been proven to work elsewhere that we haven't captured, we'd love to hear from you on that. So maybe again, we'll take 30 seconds now. There's always the option to email, and I'll get a drink of water while you guys type. Thanks. Okay, thanks everybody. So again, some great comments and great questions. So I just want to acknowledge the time, first of all. So it's 1:55. I know we had scheduled it for an hour, which is probably a little ambitious on our part. I do have just one or two more slides to go. I'll try to breeze through them because I do think they're fairly repetitive, but they do address, we do have some policies specifically provincial versus federal. And then we do want to leave time for discussion. So I'll wrap up my presentation by 2, and I'm hoping that some of you will be able to stay on for sort of another 10, 15 minutes for any other discussion. So yeah, thank you for your patience around that. So very quickly, I still believe for the provincial and territorial level, and the reason it's at this level is that electricity policy is a provincial and territorial jurisdiction. Having some kind of feed-in tariff program or a community set-aside or a COMFIT is essential. There was a comment about a power purchase agreement. It's essentially the same thing. Basically, what a FIT does, it enables people to access the grid and gives them some kind of security that their power is going to be purchased. That's essentially what a power purchase agreement does. So again, it's maybe a semantics piece. We call them FITs. It's a feed-in tariff price. A power purchase agreement for 20 years that tells you the price that you're going to be paid for your power is essentially the same thing. So just want to acknowledge that because there was a good comment and a question about power purchase agreements on the discussion. Supporting the project development process through feasibility grants and startup loans. I've talked about that. Again, that could be done at the provincial level, could be done at the federal level as well. And offering a loan guarantee for community energy projects to provide comfort to the financial sector. Again, that would be a provincial level recommendation, but also a role that the feds could play, so that's not specific. So some of these overlap. I'm going to breeze through this. If there are other provincial policies that sort of are in the making that have been shown to be effective, we'd love to hear from you about that. On the federal side, we definitely have recognized that how co-ops are treated from a tax perspective is important as far as RSP eligibility. So one of the amendments could be to the Income Tax Act to give co-ops full status as registered co-ops, even though they're registered at the provincial level. So this is sort of this provincial federal jurisdiction piece. So loan guarantees I've mentioned. The CMC, the Co-ops and Mutuals Canada, is working on an investment fund for co-ops overall and are asking for an infusion of federal money. That fund would be important for things like startup costs, loans, get projects going. So that's an initiative that we've specifically identified in the report to support CMC's work on this. There is also, I think, and this is something I'm interested in, and a few of us have been talking about, is how do we really develop the capacity nationally to move community energy forward? How do we foster knowledge sharing experiences? Right now, we're doing that by piecemealing different funding opportunities, but if there was a concerted and coordinated effort across the country funded by the federal government, for instance, to help with this sort of dialogue and move things forward, it could be really valuable because of these other benefits that community energy introduces. So that's one suggestion. And then the other suggestion we've made is a community power production incentive, or a community adder, if you will, that community groups could apply for to help them with their project costs. So these are some of the recommendations. We're interested in moving forward, and again, it's important that we are, we're very clear with our ask and that we're aligned in our ask. So that's certainly something that we're interested in feedback on, and how we, move this agenda forward at a national level. Yeah. So finally, just to sum up, I guess, before we move into discussion, and that takes us right to 2 o'clock, but, there is certainly public interest in community energy projects. I think the participation on this call is an indicator of that. The opportunities that community energy offers as far as, local economic development, community resiliency, climate mitigation, etc. These are all reasons why people are interested, but also these financial returns that are there. So we see that those interests are there. There's still policy, there's challenges, as we've identified, that are really preventing jurisdictions from moving forward. The development across Canada is certainly very uneven still, with Ontario and Nova Scotia as sort of the two jurisdictions we can look to for direct experience and lessons, but also obviously we can be looking to other jurisdictions outside of Canada. And again, we do believe FITs are the most effective policy. Some kind of fixed price contracting mechanism, call them FITs, call them power purchase agreements for communities, and those with some set-asides, with capacity building support, with loan guarantees, those we believe are some of the ingredients of successful community energy policy for Canada. So we're now moving into the discussion period. We just really wanted to give an opportunity to hear others, for you to ask questions, for you to share with each other. So we do have a protocol here. Please raise your hand, which is essentially a virtual hand on the left side of your control panel, indicating that you'd like to speak. If you can keep your comments to a minute, that would just allow more people to participate. And if you prefer to type in your questions or your comments, then we have the chat function there for you to type in. And if you could just use the questions tab for technical questions so that it's not shared with everybody. So to get things started, I'm just going to take a few seconds to read the comments that have come in already. So there was a question about what were the contributing factors that led NS in Ontario to creating FITs? What are the prospects for replicating these in other provinces? Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question. I mean, I think for one, there needs to be a perceived need for renewable energy development. If you look at Ontario was looking to phase out its coal plants, so there was an interest generally in renewable expansion. There was also, certainly in Ontario, there was, I would say the stars aligned a little bit around who was in the policy-making position and the groups that came together to push for the FIT program. It was definitely a 5-year, process of, having experience with the wind share project. There was a standard offer program in Ontario, but ultimately it was recognized that, there was a persuasive argument made by the ENGO sector, the environmental nonprofits, and the environmental non-governmental organizations, and the community power sector, for the value of community energy. And I think that's really probably the key to success, is figuring out that value proposition and how does it align with the provincial goals and objectives, because there's so many ways that you can frame renewables and community energy, and I think it's finding that fit for policymakers so that it becomes a no-brainer. In the case of Nova Scotia, it was actually, as far as I understand it, I mean, it was definitely being driven. I used to live in Nova Scotia. I actually was asked to write a policy paper for community energy in 2007. So that was the first piece. I was approached by the Ministry of Energy, but that was after a bunch of us had spent a number of years sort of holding workshops on FITs. We'd brought Paul Geip in to speak a number of times. This was through the Ecology Action Centre, the local NGO that's very active on environmental issues and energy policy in Nova Scotia. So, there is definitely that sort of sustained effort, repeating the message, not backing down is definitely some of the ingredients. I can get more into, some of those experiences if whoever asked that question wants to, follow up with an email. We could set up a phone call or whatever. But I just wanted to touch on that. Was there anybody with their hand up? Was it my toy? No?
He already asked
Oh, okay.
That was Ambrose.
Okay.
Ambrose, if you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question, that'd be great. or actually I did it for you. You can go ahead, Ambrose.
Okay, two areas that I think need to be discussed is the political support that follows renewable energy development. What happened in Germany for the first phase of development was they had a lot of co-op involvement. It evolved further as the corporations took over more and more of the generation capacity development. And in the end, they lost political support for the initiative. So I think it's really important that communities be involved because they bring to it the political support that the politicians need to push these programs forward, because there's a lot of opposition to them. The existing generators would like to keep things the way they are, especially the nuclear industry. So there needs to be political pressure built up at the same time. And the other point that follows with that one is that with community development, the profits stay in the economic jurisdiction of the province. A lot of projects that have developed privately are foreign owned, and that money basically leaves the province, and we don't get any spin on that. So the community owned ones, the money stays there. It gets spent. The butcher, buys. Gets his hair cut at the barbershop, that sort of thing, and the multiplier can be fairly significant, and that has a much larger impact than when the money leaves the province, because it often leaves with foreign investment tax-free. That's it. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Ambrose. Yeah, those are very helpful comments. Also, just again, sharing obviously that broader perspective and experiences from elsewhere. So on the other comment I see here, so there's a comment from Tom Jackman about governments not aggressively supporting community energy. And I guess I'm not sure what aggressive, what you would mean by aggressive. Don't know if you want to jump on the phone and just share your thoughts and comments. You indicate the benefits can be realized with private ownership. So I guess my argument would be you can achieve additional benefits by making them community owned, as we've illustrated in the slide, but I'm not sure if I'm interpreting your question correctly. So if you want to elaborate.
In the meanwhile, we have a hand raised by Amelia Kennedy. So Amelia, I'm muting you. You can go ahead with your question or comment.
Thank you so much for all the information that you've given today. It's invaluable. I just kind of want to use some worst case scenario thinking in the Alberta case. So assuming that that no provincial support for community energy comes forward in the next couple of years from the current government, nothing like a COMFIT or a FIT or anything like that, how can interested parties work around that? What's the next best thing to do? Because it's become clear from all the information I've received from you, Judith, that having something like a FIT is so crucial, and yet what I'm seeing is an increasing unlikeliness that we're going to get that. Mm-hmm. So what do we do? Do we move to the municipal level? What's the next best thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to acknowledge as well, and thank you for the question. Alberta is definitely somewhat of a different beast because you do have a regulated, an unregulated market, if you will. Like you've got these, the spot market pricing, etc., which does add a different level of dynamics to the whole. What is the value of the power that you're producing and time of day and all of that. So, I think the nuances of the kind of mechanism you need is definitely going to change. We had this discussion when I was in Calgary to a certain extent, and I think for sure, one of the routes to take is to go more the Danish route of requiring commercial projects to allow some community participation. I think it behooves everybody to really look at the social friction piece and what does it take to, really provide people with the comfort that these projects are not just an imposition on them, but they're actually benefiting directly from them. So, the Danish model has sort of this 20% requirement. So if you're building a wind project, 20% of it needs to be owned by the community. the risk with that is how that's interpreted. It's the model that Scotland has used a lot too, and we haven't talked a lot about Scotland, but having that sort of partial ownership by the community is definitely an interesting one to look at. It has some limitations because it does depend then on, there is always that control issue. So the community group is always at the mercy of the developer in those instances, unless, the government gets very prescriptive with the policy. And that's where, it does get challenging, is you don't want to micromanage what these relationships look like, which is why some kind of a feed-in tariff does allow a little bit more flexibility for interpretation. But that would be, at a minimum, I would say, what needs to be included. Having, requiring Aboriginal or community participation in every project that gets built, basically. If you wanted to look at what that mechanism looks like in Ontario, there is the large renewable procurement. They have made it not entirely a requirement, but there are of the latest large projects that were just initially awarded, just recently awarded. 13 of the 16 do have Aboriginal participation, and so there's obviously something in those rules. But again, the definition of what participation includes is broader than what we would, like to see as far as kind of this definition of a direct stake. So I guess that's, for the purposes of, brevity, I would probably leave it there. Well, actually, I'm going to add one thing. I guess one of the things to note about competitive procurement versus a feed-in tariff is there's a sort of a philosophical underpinning behind those two. One is this sort of idea of corporate large-scale projects driving down the price for the sake of, driving down the price, and large profit margins for corporations that don't necessarily reside in the province. That is the model that we operate in Canada. The community energy model with FITs and local investment is a fundamentally different philosophical starting point, which basically is saying this is a local resource. Communities are looking for ways to build resilience, to build revenue streams, try to retain money locally, build know-how. FITs do that. If you're just at the mercy of a large developer that you're sort of have a small stake in, it does become a different development model. As a start, I'd certainly, something is better than nothing, I would think. Although, again, depending on the design, it may, that will definitely inform things. But yeah, anyway, it's like I said, it's hard to say precisely without the nuances, all of the electricity markets that people are operating in. But I think with, over 90 jurisdictions around the world using FITs, I don't know, to me, the evidence is out there pretty conclusively.
And also at the practical level, looking at the example of Germany, I think is very telling. 50% of all renewable energy is community owned. So it is feasible to build one of the, most progressive renewable energy sectors in the world through actually driven by community energy. And when you look at Germany, the transition, you can see that the transition is not only technical, is not only technological, but also social. You can see communities having renewable energy as part of their lives. The energy is more distributed, so there's less efficiency losses and increased energy security. So at the practical level as well, community energy is a great way to build a sustainable energy sector for the long term.
Excellent. So I don't see any more hands. We've tried for the most part to address the questions. I apologize if we've missed some comments. Just hard to sort of multitask here with questions and answers. But I just want to wrap up at this point. I want to thank everybody for taking the time today to come together for this presentation, and for sharing your thoughts, your questions, your comments. It's all really a work in progress for so many of us that have been doing this work. It's we provide some suggestions, we provide some recommendations. You know, that's our experience so far. It's evolving all the time. So, you know, by no means, you know, I think part of this is about getting creative. So, you know, those who are maybe in jurisdictions where you're feeling disheartened about, you know, the tone perhaps or the direction, I think, you know, this is something for the long term. Renewable energy development is, you know, it's only going to grow. And we just need to chip away at it. And that really has been the experience here, you know, in Ontario. You know, TREC started in 1998. You know, it took 10 years. There was a 10-year break where not much was happening. But with a few projects on the ground, you know, forging the way, and I know for sure there's some in Alberta, there's groups, you know, across Canada really trying to make a go of this. I think that's how we move this forward. And so the more we can share those experiences, you know, build sort of solidarity amongst ourselves, I think, you know, that's certainly important. And so I think, you know, that's our motivation as well for these calls. So just to leave you all with some resources. We've referenced a few times the People Power Planet website. So there's a lot of resources there. More practical, so some of the research, the maps. Our Power is an initiative that TREC started to help sort of share the stories, more of the, you know, individuals on the ground, also to share some energy literacy tools. Federation of Community Power Co-ops is there. We are thinking about, you know, we're certainly open to expanding the membership of the Federation. And so you'll probably hear more about that in the months to come. But certainly interested if people have some thoughts on that, if you're interested in being part of, you know, regular dialogue, you know, maybe that might be a forum to do that. And then, of course, there's the TREC website, which is currently under development. So maybe look at it in a couple of weeks from now because it is changing. So again, my thanks to Daria for pulling this together, and to all the students that have been involved in the research, and to JJ, who's not here, JJ McMurtry, for his great support at York, and of course the funders, and to all of you, thanks again. And I guess final parting thought is if there are other themes that you're interested in, you know, we do have the opportunity to host a few more websites. Not websites, no more websites, webinars. You know, we're open to feedback on what those might cover. So send us a note, and we look forward to sharing with you and discussing with you in the future.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.